A recent budget proposal emerging from the administration of U.S. President Donald Trump suggests a fundamental change in American support for international stability mechanisms. Specifically, an Office of Management and Budget Directive, known as the PASBEC, recommends ceasing all U.S. financial contributions designated for United Nations peacekeeping operations. The stated rationale points to perceived recent failures within specific UN missions, notably those operating in Mali, Lebanon, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, coupled with a description of the U.S. financial contribution as being disproportionately high. This initiative forms part of a wider strategy aimed at significantly reducing the State Department's overall budget for the fiscal year commencing October 1st. The potential removal of these funds, which currently cover 27% of the UN's peacekeeping expenses and stem from the UN's single largest financial contributor, sets the stage for examining the precise mechanics and broader implications of such a policy shift. Understanding the scale of the U.S. financial role is crucial. American contributions constitute 22% of the United Nations' regular operating budget, and more pointedly for this proposal, 27% of its dedicated peacekeeping funds. These are not discretionary payments but established, mandatory obligations under the current framework. The OMB memo's recommendation, therefore, targets a substantial and foundational component of UN operational capacity by proposing zero funding for this specific account. This directive from the Office of Management and Budget did not arise in isolation. It functions as one element within a comprehensive push to curtail expenditures allocated to the State Department. Placing the peacekeeping cut within this broader fiscal context reveals an administrative intent to reprioritize foreign policy spending, moving resources away from established international structures. Further complicating the financial picture is the existence of outstanding U.S. payments to the United Nations. Reports indicate arrears amounting to nearly $2.7 billion across both the regular and peacekeeping budgets. This pre-existing debt adds another dimension to the proposed cessation of future peacekeeping funding, potentially straining the U.S.-UN relationship beyond the immediate impact of the cut itself. In place of the eliminated peacekeeping contributions, the administration memo introduces a different mechanism for foreign engagement. It suggests creating a new $2.1 billion America First Opportunities Fund. This fund is designed for targeted foreign aid initiatives selected by the administration, though the memo leaves open the possibility that future UN contributions could, if deemed necessary, be drawn from this discretionary pool rather than the dedicated mandatory account. The administration justifies the proposed elimination of direct peacekeeping funds by referencing operational difficulties. Specific missions in Mali, Lebanon, and the Democratic Republic of Congo are cited within the memo as examples of recent failures. These instances are presented as evidence supporting the argument that the current peacekeeping model is ineffective and that the significant U.S. investment yields insufficient results. However, the progression of this budget recommendation from proposal to policy is not assured. State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce emphasized that the budget formulation process remains underway, clarifying that no definitive plan has been finalized. Crucially, any such reduction in funding necessitates congressional approval. The executive branch can propose these cuts, but the legislative branch holds the authority to enact them into law, introducing a significant procedural check. This is not the first instance where such significant reductions targeting State Department allocations and UN contributions have been put forward by this administration. During President Trump's initial term, lawmakers received similar proposals aiming for deep cuts. Yet historical precedent shows resistance to these measures within Congress. Legislative bodies at that time largely declined to implement the full extent of the proposed reductions, suggesting potential political obstacles for the current plan. The timing of this proposal intersects with the United Nations' own reported financial challenges. The organization is understood to be navigating a liquidity crisis, a situation predating this specific American budget memo. Consequently, the removal of funding from its largest single peacekeeping contributor would invariably intensify these existing monetary pressures, although the UN itself has refrained from commenting publicly on the leaked document. Furthermore, the suggestion to potentially channel future UN support through the new America First Opportunities Fund represents a qualitative shift. It contrasts sharply with the current system of mandatory treaty-based contributions, introducing an element of discretion and aligning potential funding more directly with unilaterally defined American interests in selected aid programs, rather than established multilateral peacekeeping commitments. Delving deeper into the administration's justification reveals a specific geographical focus. The selection of Mali, Lebanon, and the Democratic Republic of Congo as exemplars of failure points towards operational challenges in complex African and Middle Eastern conflict zones, suggesting these regions are central to the assessment driving the funding recommendation. The proposed transition towards potentially funding UN activities from the discretionary America First Opportunities Fund carries significant operational implications for the United Nations. Replacing predictable, mandatory contributions with conditional funding introduces uncertainty into the UN's long-term operational planning and budgeting cycles for peacekeeping missions. This potential shift away from established multilateral funding mechanisms signals more than just a budgetary adjustment. It represents a potential realignment of U.S. foreign policy tools, prioritizing bilateral agreements or unilaterally directed aid instruments over collective security commitments enshrined in the UN framework. Such a withdrawal of guaranteed financial support, if enacted, could create tangible consequences on the ground. A significant reduction in the operational capacity of UN peacekeeping forces, resulting from the loss of their primary funder, might alter security dynamics in sensitive regions, potentially leaving security vacuums or necessitating alternative, perhaps less coordinated, interventions. Considering the international landscape, such a significant policy shift by the primary financial backer of UN peacekeeping operations inevitably sends ripples beyond the immediate budgetary figures. It invites scrutiny regarding the future of collective security frameworks and the principle of burden sharing among member states. Other major powers and traditional U.S. allies may view this proposed withdrawal of mandatory funding as a signal of diminishing American commitment to established multilateral institutions. This perception could influence their own strategic calculations and potentially prompt adjustments in their engagement with or contributions to the United Nations system. The potential weakening of UN peacekeeping capacity raises fundamental questions about the preferred mechanisms for international crisis management moving forward. If this established tool is significantly impaired, it may implicitly encourage reliance on alternative security arrangements, possibly involving regional coalitions or ad hoc interventions outside the UN structure. Furthermore, the conceptual move from legally mandated contributions to potentially discretionary allocations via a nationally branded fund like the America First Opportunities Fund touches upon core tenets of international relations. It juxtaposes the predictability of treaty-based multilateralism with the flexibility and potential conditionality of unilateral or bilaterally focused foreign policy execution. Ultimately, the long-term strategic outcome hinges not only on whether this specific proposal is enacted by Congress, but also on how the international community interprets and responds to this potential pivot in U.S. engagement with global peacekeeping structures. The implications extend beyond financial flows, touching upon diplomatic influence, the perceived reliability of treaty commitments, and the overall architecture of international security cooperation. Following the emergence of this internal budget memo, the immediate next step involves the formalization of the administration's budget request. This proposal must transition from an OMB directive into the official budget submission presented to the legislative branch for consideration. Once submitted, the proposal faces the established appropriations process within Congress. Committees in both the House of Representatives and the Senate will scrutinize the recommended funding levels, including the specific line item for UN peacekeeping contributions. This legislative review provides a critical juncture where the proposal can be debated, amended, or potentially rejected, echoing the outcomes observed during previous attempts at similar cuts. The historical resistance within Congress to drastic reductions in State Department and UN funding suggests this pathway is far from predetermined. Should the proposed cut navigate the legislative process and be enacted for the fiscal year beginning October 1st, the United Nations would confront an abrupt and significant reduction in expected revenue for its peacekeeping operations. This necessitates immediate operational adjustments within the organization. Given the UN's pre-existing liquidity challenges, such a sudden loss of nearly 27% of its peacekeeping budget would compel difficult choices. These could range from scaling back mission mandates and troop deployments to delaying reimbursements to troop-contributing countries or seeking emergency funding appeals from other member states. The operational consequences in locations like Mali, Lebanon, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the very areas cited as justification for the cuts, become a central question. Whether a drastic funding reduction improves operational effectiveness or further destabilizes fragile security situations remains a critical point of analysis as events unfold. The potential necessity for the UN to scale back its peacekeeping presence due to lost funding directly impacts the stability calculus in affected regions. A diminished international footprint could create power vacuums, potentially emboldening non-state actors or necessitating increased intervention by regional powers, thereby altering the existing security architecture. Consequently, the burden previously shared through the UN framework might shift unevenly onto remaining contributors or fall upon nations directly neighboring conflict zones. This redistribution of responsibility occurs without the structured coordination inherent in established UN mandates. Simultaneously, the proposed reliance on the discretionary America First Opportunities Fund introduces a layer of conditionality previously absent from mandatory contributions. Funding decisions channeled through this mechanism would likely prioritize alignment with specific U.S. foreign policy objectives over the broader, consensus-driven goals often embedded in UN peacekeeping mandates. This linkage between funding and specific national interests could influence the very nature of operations supported. It might favor missions or activities that directly serve perceived U.S. strategic aims, potentially at the expense of less geopolitically prominent but equally critical stabilization efforts elsewhere. Moreover, the act of withdrawing substantial mandatory funding, while simultaneously holding out the possibility of discretionary support, changes the dynamic of U.S. influence within the UN system. Leverage might shift from being derived through consistent treaty-based participation to being exercised through the selective allocation or withholding of funds from the new, nationally controlled pool. Such a scenario could also affect the behavior of other UN member states regarding their own financial commitments. Observing the largest contributor pivot away from mandatory payments might incentivize others to reevaluate their own obligations or seek similar flexibility, potentially eroding the collective financial foundation of peacekeeping over time. Thus, the administration's budget recommendation presents a potential turning point, moving beyond simple fiscal adjustment to challenge the existing framework of U.S. participation in mandated international peacekeeping. The proposal effectively juxtaposes the principle of collective security, funded through established treaty obligations, with an alternative model prioritizing nationally directed aid and discretionary engagement via the proposed America First Opportunities Fund. Its journey through the legislative process, set against the backdrop of the UN's current financial fragility and the tangible security concerns in regions reliant on peacekeepers, will therefore determine more than just funding levels. The final decision holds the potential to reshape operational realities on the ground, influence the strategic calculations of other nations, and ultimately signal a significant recalibration of America's long-term posture within the global security system. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, and be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more geopolitical insights like this. I love hearing your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Share this video with anyone interested in deeper perspectives on current events. Until next time, stay informed and think critically. Thank you.